Hello everyone, this is Darian of GNB Productions, and today we're going to be taking a look at X-Men 97. X-Men 97 is a continuation of the 90s X-Men animated series. The series centers around the X-Men still reeling from the kinda, sorta, but not really death of Charles Xavier, leaving the care of the X-Men in his old friend Magneto's hands. The team has to face off against the threat of a deadly new future that goes by the name Bastion, and his army of Prime Sentinels that poses a threat to human and mutant kind as we know it. My relationship with the X-Men animated series isn't all too extensive. I've of course loved the X-Men since I was younger with the movies, the X-Men Evolution animated series, etc. The 90s show for years wasn't something I paid too much attention to, as it was clearly before my time. But a few years back during quarantine, I decided to dive into the world of a few 90s Marvel cartoons. I watched the 90s Spider-Man series and the first 3 seasons of the 90s X-Men series. People like to say that the show doesn't hold up, but to me, while it shows its age, it's still a well-made and enjoyable series. So when they announced a continuation, I was pretty hyped. Marvel's few recent animated outings have been painfully hit or miss, so I was excited to see them go back to the good old days with this show. And now that the show's released, I can confidently say that it's fucking incredible. Like legitimately, this show is easily some of the best comic book content you'll ever consume, I promise you that. The story and writing for this series was fucking superb. I feel the need to get this out of the way first. Yes, this is a continuation of the 90s series. The story transitions almost seamlessly from where we saw these characters leave off. Yet, at the same time, I wouldn't go as far as to say that the 90s show is required viewing. You would do yourself a huge favor by watching it, not just for the sake of this show, but also for the fact that I genuinely think the 90s show is worth the watch. But this show really doesn't make the 90s show necessary to watch, and I really have to commend the writers for being able to pull that off. They did a great job at balancing pulling in old stuff for those old fans, whilst also working to make sure it stands on its own 2 feet. You want to know how I know this for sure? Even though I watched the OG series, and before the show dropped I watched a recap video, there was still shit that I didn't fully remember. But it ended up not really mattering in the end, just based on how the show handled itself. There are for sure references to past storylines and events, but nothing that holds too much weight on the overall plot. That said, in regards to it being a continuation, there are a few things that were added in that kinda bothered me. Just minor stuff that continuity buffs like me can't entirely look past. The OG show came out at a time when the whole Magneto's helmet blocks Charles's powers wasn't a thing. So to see them bring that stuff in really bothers me, as it contradicts some of the show's past events. And just little stuff like that sprinkled throughout the show, which kind of bothers me. I love what they did with the tone for this series. When watching the OG series, they had their fair share of dramatic and deep storytelling, but you could always tell they held back a bit, being a Saturday morning cartoon and all. But this show doesn't pull its punches at all, and I love it for that. There are a handful of more swears, there's multiple bits of blood shown throughout. This show is also really, really horny. I don't mean to say it as if that makes the show significantly better. I'm just happy to have more superhero media that doesn't hold itself back under the guise of being for younger audiences, especially a continuation of the 90s X-Men show. Also, the themes that the X-Men are known for are more blatantly brought up, save for them being unnecessarily vague about Magneto's backstory, but I digress. The show really allows itself to breathe so naturally. Too many Marvel shows, or shows in general for that matter, in recent years have built themselves around meandering about and not having things progress until the last few episodes. The narrative brilliantly constructs itself and gives time to itself and its characters. Not everything is perfect, but it's just so good. In comparison to how the OG show structured itself, you can tell that they made more of an effort to tell one concise story throughout. Because on the OG show, they had a plethora of episodes that teeter off and focus on one or more characters separate from the overarching plot and give them their own solo venture. The increased number of episodes per season in the OG show kind of benefited this format of storytelling with each episode. This show did the same thing, but not as effective in my opinion. With only 10 episodes to tell their story, any attempts to focus on minor characters kind of felt like they were dragging their feet a tad in my opinion. especially considering that it only happened once and on two characters that don't serve that big of a purpose in the overall story. Whether or not this change was a good or bad thing is up to you. I just thought it was interesting enough to bring up. As I said before, the themes of racism, prejudice, oppression, and all that sort have been at the core of X-Men for ages. And despite what a bunch of online piss babies have to say about it, this show handled everything revolving around it brilliantly, in my opinion. The lengths the show goes to highlight the faults of humanity, the constant infighting and bigotry, senseless hate was all executed brilliantly. Everything revolving around it in this show just feels so real. Everything from the attack on Genosha, the public aftermath of it all, this show just manages to capture the raw energy of reality in so many compelling and interesting aspects. This is an element of the X-Men that I think the movies over time has kind of started to forget about, or at least steer away from, and I'm glad this show went through great lengths to remind everyone what the X-Men are really about. That said, I do also like how this show went about adapting certain comic storylines. Now, I'll preface that a lot of this stuff I haven't read myself, but I had heard about for years. I didn't think they dare touch all the convoluted BS from the Inferno storyline, let alone manage to properly streamline it to where it works well within a single 20 to 30 minute episode. This show jumps all around with adapting different X-Men material and manages to make them seamlessly translate into the context of the show, which is what I feel like any good adaptation should strive to do. This show and Invincible, which that video will be coming soon, don't worry, takes great lengths to take what works from the book and recontextualize and tweak them for the new medium. That said, it isn't always done perfectly. Some stuff translated a bit weirdly from the comic. Like, when first watching the episode, I was kind of confused as to why Madeline Pryor in this context went by Goblin Queen. Then I had someone remind me that in the comic she actually made a deal with goblins and demons and shit. But it's just weird they added that stuff in when it really doesn't translate as seamlessly as you'd hope. Not to mention, the name Madeline Pryor also kind of just feeling shoehorned in, because that's what she goes by in the comic. For as good as some of these moments are, the show also doesn't always do the best job at delivering them, as sometimes it just feels like we're getting cliff notes of comic storylines. It's not bad, this could have been done better in a few minor aspects. Keep in mind, this is still coming from someone who hasn't read stuff like Life Death, but even then, a few aspects of what the show did here still felt a little rushed in my eyes. But the way they handled stuff like the attack on Genosha more than made up for a few of these iffy moments in my eyes. Like I said, this show just does an outstanding job at making these things feel real. And seeing the tragedy of these lives being taken was executed almost perfectly. I know the showrunner behind the show made some sort of mention of taking real-world tragedies like 9/11 and brilliantly capturing the dread witnessing something like that can cause. Everything from the scale, the destruction, the trepidation, the brutality was truly gut-wrenching. The reason I'm lingering on the Genosha bit is because it was this episode where it hit me that this show was something else entirely than what I was expecting. And I mean that in the best way. It also brilliantly started the chain of events that would take our story and characters down some pretty interesting paths. This next thing may sound a tad weird, but I also just love being in this world in particular. The universe of 90s Marvel shows is so fun and intriguing. It's almost like looking at a time capsule of when things weren't restricted by legality bullshit, or when things stray significantly away from the comics like the MCU often does. This is a universe that is inhabited and lived in, with folks like Captain America, Iron Man, Spider-Man, Daredevil, Doctor Strange, fucking Cloak and Dagger. I just love seeing a more established and lived-in Marvel universe again. But again, stuff like this did kind of piss me off.
Robert, vote yes, and you best pray our children read their textbooks more than their Bibles. For only history could be conned into forgiving us.
Sir, King T'Chaka is right.
Why the hell is Marvel so damn afraid of using T'Challa without Chadwick Boseman around? And I guess I'll talk about it now, since I don't know when I'll be able to properly bring it up. Why is Cap kind of an asshole in this show? The writers kind of treat Cap as this government lapdog who always has to do things by the book, when more often than not, Cap is the complete opposite of that. I find it very hard to believe that Cap wouldn't be extremely on board with helping out in X-Men/Mutant affairs. Apparently, this isn't even the first time X-Men writers have done this sort of thing with Cap, at least as far as the comics goes. What the hell gives? Anyway, this larger universe thing was even a benefit of the OG 90 show as well. And I'm just glad they brought this stuff over too. This show was just brilliantly written and executed. This show has a lot of characters for me to go over. Not a lot of them really get that much time in the spotlight, however. So what I'll do is I'll go over the characters I deem to be noteworthy, going from least noteworthy to most noteworthy. Starting off with Sunspot. Sunspot was introduced in the first episode and was meant to, I assume, serve as our new Jubilee for the series. Jubilee in the OG series was introduced as an audience surrogate to ease our way into this crazy world of giant mecha robots, alien game show hosts, and alien space princess affairs. Sunspot was supposed to fill that same role, but the writers very quickly forgot about him after, the first episode, in favor of focusing on other characters in the overall story, leaving Sunspot to just kind of feel like a pretty whatever character to me. He's not even bad, but they don't really do that much to make him stand out. His story of trying to come out about being a mutant to his mother and where that eventually takes him is interesting, but we never really get enough of him to really fully invest in it. It worked decently enough for what it was, but it still could have been handled better. The same can also be said for Jubilee herself. Hell, I think even in the OG show, she took a back seat relatively quickly if I'm remembering correctly. She doesn't really have that big of a role in this show either. Her and Sunspot share a single episode together, and like I alluded to earlier, it was just fine. The reason I bring the two of them up together is because the show tries to have a little romance spark between them, but I don't really think it flows as naturally as they wanted it to. That can be said for a lot of the relationship stuff this show tries to tackle. This show is ripe with soap opera goodness, but not all of it is handled particularly the greatest. Anyway, those two were just kind of okay. The episode where they enter Mojo's video game was fun, but in regards to her arc of needing to accept reality instead of focusing on games and stuff, could have been handled a bit better. Characters like Beast are as charming and fun as always. Hank McCoy might very easily be among my favorite nerds in fiction. He's just so fun as he makes references to different philosophers and literary artists and the like. He's just so fun. Nightcrawler, just Nightcrawler. I don't have that much else to say. I love Kurt Wagner, and it's just nice to see him bumped up to be a more prominent member of the team. Morph was just a fucking blast. Whenever they aren't used as the cameo machine, and that they'll just morph into random X-Men and Marvel characters, which surprisingly never gets old, they also just provide a great amount of sass that perfectly bounces off of the other characters. I love what they did with Morph and Wolverine, where the writers went out of their way to show that these two have some pretty strong romantic tension.
Hello? That you, Gambit? Logan? One too many redheads for you. Here, need some help with those hard-to-reach spaces.
The fucking...
And I think, and I may be stretching here, this may have been done for the fans of the OG series. I say that because in the first episode of the whole show where Morph dies, Logan was shown to be the most upset about it. That may just be me looking for stuff, but when I thought about it from that lens, I just couldn't help but love these two as a ship more. Now, if only they had the balls to have Logan fuck off a Jean and do something with Morph. And since I've brought him up numerous times already, I love how this show chooses to use Wolverine. He takes a significant backseat compared to the other characters, and I couldn't love the writers more for doing so. Don't get me wrong, I love Wolverine. I've been a grade A Wolvie dick writer since I was a kid. But Christ on a stick, was it getting tiring to have him be the only important X-Men character. I'm so glad this show put him on the back end and gave others time in the spotlight. That said, they do a few things that kinda frustrate me a bit. Namely, they toy around with the whole love triangle with Jean thing. And like Raphael's lone wolf behavior in some TMNT media, it's just one of those things I'm starting to care less and less about. But other than that, yeah, he was great. It's about damn time we get to see him use his claws to slice up people properly. It's really a shame that Bishop didn't have a role in this show at all. I gotta ask, and it has been a while since I've watched the OG show, but was there any reason for why he was even in the present to begin with? He was just kinda there with no real explanation as to why. I think narratively they had him there as a good reason for Cable ending up in the future, but still, kinda weird. Speaking of which, I like how they handled Cable in this show. He didn't have that interesting of an arc or story, but his interactions with Cyclops and Jean were pretty interesting, and all the family moments they share were cute as hell. It's even especially cool to see, even for a mere glimpse, have Nathan utilize his psychic powers. I'm aware Cable is powerful as shit in some comics, and it's nice to see a glimpse of the potential he has. Other than that, like I said, he never had that interesting of an arc this season, but the stuff we did get was still cool as hell. And it looks like Season 2 is planning on using him in some pretty interesting ways, so we'll see what happens there. Storm in the OG series was among my personal favorites, and I adored every second of what they did with her this season. Granted, the whole hero losing their power and going on a journey of self-discovery isn't necessarily a new or even original thing, but it's just the execution of it all that I love. The theme of her powers being primarily gone due to her own self-doubt and self-deprecation was executed pretty well. And even when she eventually gets them back, it is nothing but awe-inspiring. Like I alluded to before, the relationship she has going on with Forge isn't the greatest. But I guess it works for what it does. It's not like I could never imagine these guys getting together, but like with Sunspot and Jubilee, it could have just used a bit more breathing room. Rogue and Gambit. Okay. See now look, I love what the show did with its characters, and especially how it goes about picking up where the original series left off. And I still of course believe you can watch this show without viewing the original. That said, however, there are a few moments that I feel are just a bit more impactful had you watched the original, namely with Gambit. Gambit in the season didn't get that much time to shine, but the stuff they did do with him and his relationship with Rogue was still pretty interesting. This is where we get that juicy X-Men soap opera goodness, and I loved every second of it. The whole thing with Rogue not being able to touch anyone until there seems to be a loophole that she can exploit, I'll get further into that later, but the drama between these two and the love they share despite the lack of real physical intimacy is just so good. And then we get to Gambit's death. See now look, this episode on its own does a great job at getting you to emotionally feel for Remy, but I feel like this loses a bit of its impact when you realize Gambit hasn't had that big of a presence before this point. Regardless, his death was still truly heartbreaking. Whether you watch the OG or not, you can't deny that this was fucking heartbreaking.
Sugar. I can't feel you.
The show obviously has more plans for Gambit, so we'll see how that pans out. And Rogue, oh yeah, she kicked ass. It's nice to see some cool action from Rogue after having the movies do absolutely jack shit with her. Her story this season was absolutely insane. Firstly, the relationship she had with Magneto completely fucking blew my mind. I'm having trouble remembering if they even interacted in the OG show, but regardless, I think everything surrounding this was done brilliantly. That loophole in her not being able to touch anyone was Magneto, in that he can generate a small electromagnetic field around his body, which allows for them to make contact. I love how they add in stuff like this to even catch viewers of the OG show off guard. Everything revolving around this was just oh so delectable. Her choosing Magneto over Gambit initially may seem a bit fucked up, but given the cards she's been dealt, you can very much understand it. But after all that, she realizes the mistake she made, and she tragically never got to tell him that she chose him before he died. After Gambit's death, she goes fucking crazy, and the dark path she ventures on is just so damn good. Rogue was as cool as ever, and the journey she goes through this season was cool as hell. Charles Xavier wasn't in this season all that much, which makes sense considering a crux of one of the main conflicts is his absence and how the X-Men deal with it. But regardless of that, the time he was on screen, he was still pretty good. Nothing else to say beyond that. Now let's get into Jean Grey. Everything revolving around Jean and Madeline Pryor I thought was executed brilliantly. We start off the series with Scott and a pregnant Jean Grey. Not long after she gives birth, the real Jean shows up and it's revealed that the one we've been following for the past few episodes is a clone created by the villain Mr. Sinister. While not perfect, I love everything revolving around this so much. I like that the show doesn't go out of its way to spell out when the switch up even happened. Whenever shows tackle the whole clone thing, I feel like the first thing on everyone's mind is when it happened or who the real clone is. And this show just decides not to go into all that. Not to mention, they make it obvious enough that the switch up occurred sometime after Jean became the Phoenix, so there's that. That and the very troubling relationship she has with Scott after the fact is just mwah, so good. But regardless, I like where they end up, and her going as far as to adopt and view Nathan as her own son was pretty cute. Madeline as well, even though her time on screen was unfortunately short, still undoubtedly left an impact. She's not just some evil clone or whatever. Her and Jean are a part of each other respectively, and I love that. Not to mention that um, sweet fucking Christ. Scott fucking Summers. For years, this character has been nothing but a joke in the public eye, being constantly sidestepped to Wolverine because the movie writers didn't give enough of a shit about him to give him anything meaningful to do. When I watched the OG series, I came to the startling realization that Cyclops is actually kind of fucking cool. And it's about damn time others started realizing it too, because I feel like the folks behind this show, above all else, had to prove something from the get go. And it's that Cyclops is a fucking badass. Everything from the kick ass utilization of his powers to showing his skills as the team leader, you can tell these motherfuckers had something to prove and they did an excellent job at it. And not only do they show how cool he is, they also go out of their way to show that Scott is really, really, really fucking messy. This man was having a psychic affair with his clone baby mama while his girlfriend was in the other fucking room. Good God. Yeah, Scott throughout this show is a bit of a fucking mess, and I couldn't love him any more for it, honestly. Whether it's the psychic affair or walking out on his infant son, despite saying several seconds earlier that he wouldn't do that, Scott has a lot going on. But I love how they expertly show why he's the team leader. After having ages of Wolverine in the spotlight, X-Men 97 shows how fucking important Cyclops is to the X-Men. The villains of this show are top notch. This season only really has about 3 major villains: Mr. Sinister, Bastion, and Magneto. Mr. Sinister is an okay villain for the season. He's not bad, as he has an incredibly foreboding and chilling presence whenever he's on screen, but more than halfway through, he's kind of just treated as a lackey to the main villain, Bastion. I don't know enough about Sinister to really be that upset about this. Yeah, I remember him from the OG show, but like I said, that was years ago. So a lot of the plots revolving around him, I kind of just don't have a clear recollection of. If there's one thing that's a little disappointing, is that they never really do anything with him in Morph. Morph was revived by Sinister and had their mind all fucked because of it. They even make a reference to it in this season. So it's a shame that we never got a proper confrontation between the two. Anyway, Sinister was fine. Now Bastion is where things really start to get interesting. See, with Bastion, they kind of do that thing I mentioned earlier. Remote shows kind of leave the bigger stuff towards the end, so it results in some stuff feeling rushed. But they kind of cleverly skirt around that issue when it comes to Bastion, because not only was he hinted at and sprinkled in throughout several episodes beforehand, they also take the proper amount of time to go over what his deal is. I know his story is a bit convoluted in the comics, so it seems like the writers took some liberty streamlining it a bit. So in the future, there is this advanced sentinel called Nimrod. Nimrod sent some future goo into the past to infect this random dude so that he could produce a child who we know as Bastion. Therefore, Bastion is part human, part sentinel. He then devises a plan to infect other humans with this techno-organic virus strain to create more human sentinel hybrids to enslave mutants. And he's going to kill any humans that don't support him as well. Needless to say, this was pretty interesting. Bastion as a villain is pretty cool. He's pretty suave and charismatic, and his powers are also pretty damn cool. And everything he kind of represents thematically, being the literal embodiment of a future world being thrusted upon the X-Men unexpectedly. Kind of like how mutants started popping up randomly more and more, and humans would eventually have to accept it. Which is why it didn't really bother me when the X-Men attempted to reach out and appeal to Bastion. Is it cliche that the heroes would lend out a helping hand to the psychotic, murderous bad guy? Yes. But does it still make sense thematically for the X-Men to do this? Also yes. Bastion was a pretty good villain and a pretty unique foil to the X-Men. Mag-fucking-Neato. What can I say about this character that hasn't already been said before? In the movies, and hell, Marvel Comics in general, Magneto has always been an extremely intriguing character to me, for obvious reasons. But the journey they had him go through this season is absolutely superb. Crazy that he's the one that had the most impactful arc to me. Him attempting to take charge and lead the X-Men as per Charles's wish was such an interesting angle to take. You can really see the struggle to give up his old ways for the sake of his friend's dying wish, but still puts in the work to gain the trust of humanity and the X-Men. It's truly some compelling stuff. That said, I do wish we'd gotten to see more of him as team leader. This was a pretty big shakeup to the status quo of the OG series, and I wish we just got a bit more time to see how Magneto in the leading role would have been. But regardless, after Genosha, this motherfucker goes all the way off. Shuts down Earth's electromagnetic pull and just says fuck humans and was gonna leave they ass for dead. The man literally ripped the fucking adamantium from Logan's fucking skeleton. Holy shit! Although this turnaround wasn't necessarily unexpected, it was still cool as hell. I still love how they play off of the nuances of Eric's character. Because even in the end, they allude to him still working to make Magneto someone who is a force for good. I know I already discussed Charles before, but even with the limited amount of screen time they have, the relationship between these two was expertly handled. These two have some of the most interesting dynamics in Marvel Comics, and it's so cool to see that while on opposing ends, they still respect and care for each other and their shared ideologies. I mentioned earlier that something that bugs me is that they're still unnecessarily vague with his backstory, however. Because yeah, Eric is a Holocaust survivor and that's a major part of his story, but they really couldn't go that in depth in the OG show, because kids' cartoon and whatnot. But I see no reason as to why they still have to be vague about it now. It's treated more as a if you know kind of thing. It's just really weird. Anyway, Magneto fucking rocked. The character writing in this show was just fucking incredible. Yeah, a lot of them don't have that many interesting arcs or anything like that, but all of them are charismatic, charming, fun, and easy to get behind. All around, the characters in this show were amazing. The voice cast did an absolutely amazing job. They brought back as many of the folks as they could from the original. Some of them are reprising their roles of their respective characters, whilst being switched up and around to play other characters. You have the return of Cal Dodd as Wolverine, who I'd say does a better job here than he did in the original. That's not to say he was bad back then, as I enjoyed his performance, but here I think he just fits more naturally.
What Gyrick did was pretty horrible. But want to know the worst part about the professor being gone? You. Jeez, Dad. Keep buzzing in my ear. What would we do if we ever lost you?
Why the heck didn't you stop Genosha?
Take a seat, Logan.
Daddy's own.
Alison Seeley Smith does an absolutely incredible job stepping back into the role of Storm. She does an amazing job at capturing the simple and kind side of her, whilst also bringing in this godly presence whenever she uses her powers.
I am Storm, mistress of the elements. Surrender the boy, or face my fury! You all are an echo of who I am. So let them thunder, for I am lightning. Ancient sands, heed my command, and reclaim these relics of hatred!
George Buza, of course, kills it as Beast. He'll probably always be my go-to voice whenever I think of the character. He always knows how to deliver so much whimsical energy to the character. I can't properly describe it, but I just love it so much.
Greetings, enemy mine. Might I induce you to a change of heart? Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful involuntary friendship. Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. The ever-affable Mr. Rogers.
Perhaps the Professor's vision for the future was too nearsighted, and begging for your tolerance was our first mistake.
Lenora Zahn makes her return as Rogue, and she's one of the few who I think suffered most from her absence from the character. That's not to say that she was bad, because she still did an incredible job. But in the OG series where Rogue had a more smooth Southern Belle kind of voice, here it just feels like Zahn didn't easily slide back into that like the others did. Her voice this time around is noticeably more high-pitched, which I just really can't get behind. But other than that, I still think she did an outstanding job.
Thought your kind were the good guys.
You killed those, Sugar. Now, you get me. We've rodeoed more Sentinels than I care to count. And Storm and Bishop are made of sterner stuff than you think.
I can't touch you, Remy. Your heart may beat for me, but I can't feel it.
Chris Potter, funnily enough, doesn't return as Gambit. That role was given to AJ Locascio. That role was given to AJ Locascio, who does an amazing job at capturing the energy Potter brought to the character.
Rogue always come to Gambit's rescue. I'll take a cappuccino if you just taking orders. Mon ami, maybe Gambit should have played less rough with you in the danger room, n'est-ce pas? But the cards, they wild. Gambit, see your bet. And raise it! The cards always be in my favor!
But Potter instead was given the role of Cable, and I thought he was amazing. I don't know if this was intentional, but I feel like they took Brolin's take on Cable from Deadpool 2 into consideration for the voice, because I can hear some similarities there. And to be honest, this may be my preferable take on Cable going forward. He has this cool grizzled and jaded approach that fits the character incredibly well. I admittedly don't remember how Lawrence Byrne, the OG Cable voice, sounded right off the top of my head, but Potter just did a great job in my opinion.
Electromagnetic cluster grenades are the quickest way to take these suckers down. My real mother was a world-class telekinetic, just like you. Stuff tends not to skip a generation. Those rebel leaders I told you about in the future, rambling about the adventures of the X-Men, getting folks inspired. It pissed me the hell off. I belonged in those stories too, growing up.
I think that's all the returning cast. Now onto the newbies. I fucking love Ray Chase as Cyclops. He does an absolutely superb job at carrying the same tone of the late Norm Spencer, where it's almost nearly identical. Chase just has some really great range as a voice actor. The emotion, the confident attitude, the assertive authority was all executed brilliantly.
Before he starts up again.
No, don't! I surrender! Not. Trask would rather humans and mutants go to war than work together. We all win when men like him fail. I gave him up because you can't say thank you. Because I have to stomach your questions and prove that I'm a person. I lie because the truth is we're nothing like you. Thank God, because it's the only reason you people are still alive.
The same can be said for Jennifer Hale as Jean Grey and Madeline Pryor. There's admittedly not much I can say besides she killed it, especially as Madeline.
Whole galaxies beckoned me, but I turned my back for you. Sinister cuts out a part of me and you love it? That wasn't love in there, it's ego. I am scorn and fury, forged in righteous brimstone. I am the Goblin Queen! Nathan, how could I forget? He's more than a memory. He's a living reminder of the purest love two people can share. And no one can ever take that away from you.
Isaac Robinson Smith did a great job as Bishop, for the little amount of time he was on screen at least. Holly Chow did a great job as Jubilee, and they actually did manage to bring in Allison Court, the OG voice for Jubilee, to play an older version of the character. It's like a little passing of the torch thing, and it's kind of cute. J.P. Karliak did an outstanding job as Morph. Guy Agostini, I'm sorry if I'm butchering these names by the way, as well did a pretty good job as Sunspot. Ross Marquand and Matthew Watterson do an absolutely phenomenal job as Charles Xavier and Magneto respectively. Marquand did an incredible job as the kind and caring professor, as someone who aims to lead mutant kind into a bright and coexistent future.
For my X-Men, their heroism teaches a lesson we mustn't forget. That the universe is very old, and all of us very young, born of ancient stardust, and all children of the atom. From the moment I first met you, that you would help build a world where mutants could live however they wish, but that you would never allow yourself to enjoy it. Perhaps that was a mistake, because just like you, I'm right back here.
But Watterson as Magneto goes all the way off. This is the voice of a man who was on very thin ice between coexisting with humans or just decimating them entirely, and I loved every second of it. Almost every single line is delivered with such intense gravitas that I can't help but love it.
So small I could smite you with a step. There was a time I would smite you all for what was done to Storm. But today, I have saved you from your own. For an old friend has challenged me to remember this view of Earth. I am trying to be better. Please. Do not make me let you down.
The animation for this show is absolutely incredible. There was a big fuss before the show premiered about them using 3D animation in some shots. And yeah, there is some usage and it is super noticeable, especially in the earlier episodes. But other than that, it mainly has the classic 2D hand-drawn style. I'm not fully sure if this was actually hand-drawn or not, but what I'm saying is it looks like they did a near perfect job recapturing the style of the 90s Marvel shows. The action sequences, direction, and choreography is absolutely top notch. This is some of the most visually satisfying pieces of comic book media you will ever watch. I really hate to beat a dead horse, but the fact that this released so close to Invincible Season 2 is insane. Where the animation of that show is decent for the most part, but nothing there even holds a candle to the eye candy that is X-Men 97. There are a few moments where the show limits itself with having more stiffer movements and facial expressions. That could either be a way to save on budget, or be a way of paying homage to the limited animation of the original show. Or just be a bit of both, who knows. Every time Magneto uses his powers, it's incredible. Wolverine and Nightcrawler going at it was sick as hell. And the big team-up move in the finale was just, mwah, delectable. This show is just a visual wonder. The music in this show was absolutely amazing as well. We of course have the return of the original 90s X-Men theme that you bet your ass I sat through that opening each and every damn time. I love how they managed to utilize that theme in so many different ways, whether it be the opening or during various action sequences. That sounds like it could get really old really damn fast, but in practice it managed to get you pumped every single time. Not just that, but the overall score was pretty great too. That and the use of Ace of Base's Happy Nation was absolutely fucking amazing. Overall, X-Men 97 is just a phenomenal animated series, with amazing story writing and character work, an impeccably delivered tone that executes its themes and messages brilliantly, an outstanding voice cast that's composed of new and returning faces, absolutely breathtaking animation and action choreography that carry on a ton of weight and pizzazz, and as a whole is probably one of the best pieces of comic book media in recent years, and I absolutely cannot wait for Season 2. So, with all that said, if you agree or disagree with anything I've said in this video, let me know right down there in the comments below. Also, be sure to like and subscribe. This is Darion of GNB Productions, and take care.